For 150 years, this diary was never opened. Not because it was lost, not because no one knew it existed, but because the people who found it chose not to read it. It was discovered by accident. Like most things that were never meant to be found, the plantation had been abandoned for decades, slowly decaying under the weight of time. The wood had begun to rot. The paint had peeled away in long, curling strips. Windows were broken, letting in dust, wind, and silence. It was the kind of place people passed by, but never entered. Not because there were signs warning them to stay away, but because something about it felt wrong. Not dangerous, just wrong. The kind of wrong that doesn't need explanation. The kind your instincts understand before your mind does. Locals had stories, of course. Places like this always do. Whispers passed down quietly, never spoken too loudly, never written down. Stories about voices heard at night, about figures seen in the distance where no one should have been, about a feeling, heavy, suffocating, that settled over anyone who stayed too long. But stories fade. Curiosity doesn't. And that's how it began. A small restoration team was sent to assess the property. Nothing unusual, just routine work. Measure the damage, document the structure, decide whether it could be saved, or if it needed to be torn down completely. They weren't looking for history. They weren't looking for secrets. They were just looking at walls, floors, ceilings, until one of those walls sounded hollow. At first, it was dismissed. Old buildings shift, wood warps, spaces form where there shouldn't be any. But the sound was different, too clean, too deliberate, and when they pressed against it, it gave slightly. That was enough. They began to remove the paneling carefully, expecting nothing more than empty space behind it. Maybe old wiring, maybe forgotten tools, something ordinary. But what they found wasn't ordinary. Behind the wall, wrapped in layers of aged cloth, was a small object, protected, hidden, preserved in a way that didn't feel accidental. It wasn't placed there casually. It was sealed, as if someone had gone out of their way to make sure it would never be discovered. And yet it was. The cloth was brittle, fragile from time, but still intact enough to hold its shape. As it was unwrapped, slowly, carefully, the air in the room seemed to change. Not in a way that could be measured, not something visible, but something noticeable. The kind of silence that feels heavier than it should. The kind that makes people stop talking without knowing why. Inside the cloth was a diary, small, worn, bound in dark leather that had cracked with age. The edges of the pages were yellowed, uneven, as if they had absorbed more than just time. There was no title, no name on the cover, no indication of who it belonged to. Just a simple object, ordinary in appearance, but not in presence. Because the moment it was uncovered, something shifted. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. The discovery should have been exciting. Unexpected finds like this usually are. A piece of history hidden for over a century. That's the kind of thing people talk about. The kind of thing that gets documented, studied, shared. But this didn't feel like that. There was hesitation, subtle at first. A pause before anyone reached for it. A glance exchanged between people, as if silently asking the same question. Should we open it? And for a moment, no one did. Because something about it felt deliberate. Not just hidden, but meant to stay hidden. And that difference mattered. Eventually, curiosity won. It always does. One of them picked it up, carefully, almost reluctantly. The leather felt cold, colder than it should have been. The pages, though old, were not as fragile as expected. They held together, firm, as if time hadn't affected them the way it should have. He opened it, just slightly, just enough to see the first page, and then he stopped. Not dramatically, not in fear, just stopped, closed it again, said nothing, and placed it back down. At first, it seemed like nothing. Maybe the writing was faded. Maybe it was in a language he didn't understand. Maybe it just wasn't as interesting as expected. But when someone else asked what was inside, he didn't answer. Not clearly, not directly, just shook his head slightly and said, probably nothing important. But his tone didn't match his words, because something had changed. Not in the diary, in him. And that's when the unease began to spread. Slowly, quietly. The kind of unease that doesn't come from what you see, but from what you don't. because whatever was written on that first page was enough to make him not want to continue, and that alone was unusual. Days passed. The diary remained where it was found, documented, photographed, but not opened again. No one pushed it. No one insisted. It was as if an unspoken agreement had formed around it. Leave it, ignore it, move on. But ignoring something doesn't remove its presence. If anything, it makes it stronger, because now it's not just an object. It's a question, one that sits quietly in the background, waiting to be answered. And questions like that don't stay unanswered forever. Eventually, someone always goes back, and someone did. Late, after hours, when the others had left. The house was quieter then, still, the kind of silence that makes every small sound feel amplified. Footsteps echoing slightly, the creak of old wood under weight, the faint movement of air through broken windows. He found the diary exactly where it had been left, untouched, waiting. This time, there was no hesitation. He picked it up, opened it, and began to read. The first lines were simple, almost ordinary, nothing alarming, nothing unusual, just daily entries, dates, observations, notes about the plantation, weather, work, routine. It didn't make sense. Why had the others reacted the way they did? Why had it felt so wrong? He kept reading, page after page, and slowly, something changed. Not suddenly, not in a way that could be clearly defined, but gradually, the tone shifted. The writing became different, less structured, more personal, more aware, as if the person writing it wasn't just recording events anymore, but reacting to something they didn't fully understand, something they were trying to make sense of. And the deeper he read, the more that feeling grew. That something wasn't right, that this wasn't just a record of daily life, that there was something else beneath the surface, something that hadn't revealed itself yet, but was getting closer. And then, he reached a line, just one, simple, out of place, not dramatic, not even fully explained, but enough to make him stop, enough to make him realize this diary wasn't meant to be read, because whatever was written inside wasn't just history, it was something else, something that had been hidden, on purpose. But the real question isn't why the diary was hidden. It's what was written in those pages that made the person who found it never speak about it again. At first, there was nothing unusual about the diary. The pages were filled with simple entries, dates written carefully at the top of each page, neat handwriting, controlled, almost disciplined, the kind of writing you would expect from someone who followed routine, who valued order, who believed in structure. The first few entries spoke about the plantation itself, the land, the crops, the changing weather. It described the rhythm of daily life in a way that felt almost peaceful. There were mentions of early mornings, of long days under the sun, of the quiet that settled over the fields at night. It painted a picture that felt normal, predictable, safe, too safe, because there was something about it that felt controlled, not just in the way it was written, but in what was being written. Every detail seemed carefully chosen, not random observations, but selective ones, as if the writer wasn't just recording reality, but presenting a version of it, a version that avoided certain things, ignored certain details, left out anything that might disrupt the calm, structured tone of the entries. And at first, that didn't seem strange. People write diaries in different ways. Some focus on routine. Some avoid emotional expression. Some simply record facts without reflection. But the more the pages turned, the more that consistency began to feel unnatural. Because real life isn't that clean. It isn't that controlled. There are always small irregularities, moments that break routine, details that don't fit perfectly into the structure. But here, there were none. Everything aligned, too perfectly. And that's where the first doubt appeared. Not because of what was written, but because of what wasn't. There were no names, no mention of specific individuals beyond vague references like the workers or the overseer. No personal connections, no emotional attachments, no conflicts, no moments of tension, just a steady, uninterrupted flow of controlled observations. And that absence was noticeable, because a place like this, a plantation, should have been filled with people, voices, interactions. But in these pages, it felt empty, as if the writer was deliberately avoiding something, or someone. Still, nothing in those early entries was openly disturbing. Nothing that would explain the reaction of the first person who had opened the diary. Nothing that would justify the unease that seemed to surround it, until the tone began to shift. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, it started with small changes. A word here, a phrase there. Nothing dramatic, nothing that stood out immediately, but enough to create a difference. A slight change in the rhythm of the writing. A hesitation where there hadn't been one before. A sentence that felt unfinished, as if the writer had stopped mid-thought and chosen not to continue. And then, there were corrections. Words scratched out. Rewritten. Not because they were incorrect, but because they said too much. Because they revealed something that the writer seemed to reconsider after putting it on the page. And that's when it became clear. This wasn't just a record. It was a filter. A version of events that was being controlled, even as it was being written. As if the writer was aware that someone might read it, that these pages might be seen, and that certain things should not be written down. But control isn't perfect, and over time, it begins to slip. The entries became longer, less structured, more fragmented. The neat handwriting started to lose its consistency. Letters became uneven. Lines became slightly distorted, as if the writer's state of mind was changing slowly, gradually, without fully realizing it. And with that change came details, small at first, barely noticeable, a mention of something unusual in the fields, not explained, just noted, then ignored in the next entry, as if it hadn't been important, as if it hadn't happened. But it had, because it was written, and once something is written, it exists, even if it's never mentioned again. And those small details began to accumulate. A sound heard at night, described briefly, then dismissed. A figure seen in the distance, not identified, not approached, just observed, then never mentioned again. And each time, the pattern repeated. Something unusual would appear in the writing, and then disappear, as if the writer was trying to convince themselves that it didn't matter, that it wasn't real, that it wasn't worth recording. But the fact that it was recorded at all said otherwise. Because people don't write things down unless they feel the need to remember them. And the more these details appeared, the harder they became to ignore. Because now, the entries weren't just about routine. They were about something else. Something that was being noticed, but not understood. Something that existed on the edges of the writer's awareness. Something that was becoming more frequent, more present, more difficult to dismiss. And then, the first real break happened. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden shift. It was just a single entry. That didn't follow the pattern. The date was written, but the structure was gone. No neat observations. No controlled descriptions. Just a short line. Unsteady. Almost rushed. I was told not to write about them. Nothing else. No explanation. No continuation. Just that. And then, the next entry returned to normal. As if nothing had happened. As if that line didn't exist. As if it had never been written. But it had. And now, everything before it felt different. Because now there was context. Now, the absence of names made sense. Now, the missing details felt intentional. Because there were things on that plantation that were not meant to be recorded. Not meant to be acknowledged. Not meant to exist in writing. And yet, they did. In fragments. In hints. In lines that slipped through the control. And that's when the realization began to form. This diary wasn't incomplete by accident. It was incomplete on purpose. Because the truth was being hidden, even from the pages themselves. But the deeper the writer went, the harder it became to maintain that control. Because whatever was happening was becoming impossible to ignore. The entries started to reflect that. More corrections. More unfinished thoughts. More moments where the writing seemed to hesitate, as if the writer was choosing between telling the truth and staying silent. And slowly, that choice became harder, because the truth was getting closer, closer to the surface, closer to being written, closer to being seen. And once something like that begins, it doesn't stop, because the more you try to hide something, the more it finds ways to appear, in small details, in subtle changes, in lines that don't quite fit, but can't be erased completely. And that's exactly what was happening here. The diary was breaking, not physically, but structurally. The control was slipping. The filter was weakening. And whatever had been hidden was beginning to emerge. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to change everything. But the most disturbing part wasn't the strange entries. It was the realization that the writer wasn't just hiding the truth. They were afraid of something that was already there, something that wasn't supposed to exist at all. By the time the pattern became impossible to ignore, the diary had already changed. What once felt controlled, structured, carefully filtered, was now something else entirely. The neat boundaries that had once defined every entry were beginning to collapse. The writing was no longer just a record. It had become a struggle, a quiet, internal conflict playing out line by line, word by word, as if the writer was trying to hold something back and failing. And that's when the names began to appear. Not clearly, not all at once, but in fragments. A single name, written softly between lines that didn't seem to belong together. Not introduced, not explained, just placed there, as if it had slipped out unintentionally, as if the writer hadn't meant to include it, but couldn't stop themselves. The next entry didn't mention it again. It returned to the familiar tone, the safe tone, the controlled version of reality that had defined the beginning of the diary. But now something had changed. Because once a name appears, its absence becomes impossible to ignore. And slowly more began to surface. Different names, different references. Some repeated, some mentioned only once. None explained, none connected to any official record. They didn't belong to the plantation as it was described. They weren't listed as workers. They weren't acknowledged as part of the structure. They existed only in these pages. And even here, they were barely allowed to exist at all, because every time a name appeared, it was followed by hesitation, words scratched out, sentences cut short, moments where the writer seemed to realize what they had done and tried to correct it. But correction isn't the same as erasure, because once something is written, it leaves a trace, and those traces began to form a pattern. Not a complete one, not something that could be easily understood, but something consistent enough to suggest that these people were not accidents. They were not mistakes. They were there, on the plantation, living, working, existing, but not officially, not publicly, not in any way that history would recognize. And that realization changed everything, because now the diary wasn't just hiding details. It was revealing something that had been deliberately removed. An entire group of people whose presence had been erased so completely that the only evidence of their existence was slipping through the pages of a single, hidden diary. And even that evidence was incomplete, because the writer wasn't telling their story directly. They were circling around it, avoiding it, touching it only briefly before pulling away, as if even writing about them was dangerous, as if acknowledging them was something that wasn't allowed. And yet, the entries kept returning to them, not in clear descriptions, but in moments, small glimpses, a line about someone being moved from one place to another, without explanation, a note about voices heard at night, not from the main house, but from somewhere further away, a mention of those below, written once, then never again. Each fragment was incomplete, but together, they created something far more disturbing, because now, the plantation didn't feel empty anymore. It felt hidden, layered, as if there was another version of it, existing beneath the one that was being described. A version that wasn't meant to be seen, wasn't meant to be known, wasn't meant to exist in any official sense. And the writer was aware of it, not just aware, affected by it, because the tone of the entries began to change again, not just in structure, but in emotion. There was something new in the writing now, something that hadn't been there before. Fear, not open, not clearly stated, but present, in the hesitation of certain words, in the way sentences stopped before they could fully form, in the repeated attempts to return to normal, and the inability to stay there. Because once the truth begins to surface, it doesn't stay hidden, and the writer was beginning to realize that. The entries became more fragmented, more unstable, less concerned with maintaining the appearance of control, and more focused on something else, understanding, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. What they were hearing, what they were slowly beginning to realize had always been there, because the more the writer observed, the clearer it became. These people were not part of the plantation. They were beneath it, not metaphorically, literally, hidden, kept out of sight, kept out of record, kept out of history. And that's when the emotional weight of it began to appear. Because now, the entries weren't just observations. They were reactions, questions that didn't have answers, descriptions that felt incomplete, because the writer didn't know how to fully express what they were seeing. A line about a child seen briefly, then gone. No name, no explanation, just a presence, a moment, and then nothing. Another entry describing a sound, not of work, not of routine, but something else, something softer, something that didn't belong to the structure of the plantation as it had been described. And each time these details appeared, they were followed by silence, as if the writer didn't know how to continue, or didn't want to, because acknowledging something like this changes everything. Because now, the plantation wasn't just a place. It was a system, a structure that operated on two levels. One visible, one hidden, one recorded, one erased. And the people in that hidden layer were not meant to be seen, not meant to be heard, not meant to be remembered. And yet, they were there, living in conditions that were never described, experiencing things that were never recorded, existing in a space that history had completely ignored. And the writer had become aware of them. But awareness doesn't always lead to action. Sometimes it leads to fear, because knowing something that isn't supposed to be known comes with consequences, and those consequences were beginning to appear. The entries started to reflect a growing tension, a sense that the writer was being watched, not directly, not openly, but in small ways, subtle shifts, moments where something felt different, where the environment no longer felt neutral, as if the act of writing was being noticed, as if the diary itself was not safe. And yet, the writing continued, because once you see something like this, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to the version of reality you had before. You can't pretend that the hidden layer doesn't exist, because now it's real, and it changes everything. The writer began to write less about routine and more about presence, not clearly, not directly, but in ways that suggested something constant, something always there, something that didn't leave. And the emotional weight of it became impossible to ignore, because these weren't just hidden people. They were lives, real lives, ignored, erased, removed from history as if they had never mattered, as if they had never existed. And that is what makes this part of a diary so disturbing. Not just the fact that they were hidden, but the fact that they were made invisible, not just physically, but historically, systematically removed from any record that would acknowledge them. And the only reason we know they existed at all is because someone for a brief moment failed to keep them hidden. But the most disturbing part wasn't that these people were hidden. It was what was being done to them, something so controlled, so deliberate, that even the writer was afraid to describe it fully. By the time the diary reached its later entries, it was no longer trying to hide the truth. It was trying to survive it. The careful structure that once defined every page had completely broken down. The handwriting, once steady, controlled, almost disciplined, had become uneven. Lines drifted slightly. Words pressed harder into the paper, as if written with urgency or fear. There were fewer corrections now, fewer attempts to maintain order, as if the writer had realized that control was no longer possible. Because what they were witnessing couldn't be controlled, couldn't be explained, and most importantly, couldn't be justified. The entries began to focus on a specific area of the plantation, not the fields, not the main house, but somewhere else, referred to only in fragments. The lower section, the place beneath, never described directly, never mapped out, but always present, always there, just beyond the edges of what was openly acknowledged. And slowly, that place became the center of everything. The writer no longer tried to ignore it. They couldn't, because whatever was happening there was beginning to affect everything above it. The sounds became more frequent, not random, not natural, but rhythmic, deliberate, as if something was being done repeatedly, systematically, the kind of repetition that doesn't belong to routine work, but to something else entirely. something controlled, something designed. And the people, the ones who had only appeared as fragments before, were now clearly connected to it, no longer just hidden presences, but participants, subjects. Though the word was never written, it was implied, in the way they were described, not as individuals, but as groups, moved, positioned, observed. There was no mention of conversation, no indication of choice, no sign of identity beyond the occasional name that slipped through and was never repeated. They weren't being recorded as people, they were being recorded as something else. And that realization was where the true horror began, because now the diary wasn't just revealing that these people existed, it was revealing what was being done to them. But even then, the writer struggled to describe it, not because they didn't understand it, but because understanding it made it harder to put into words. The entries became fragmented again, shorter, more intense, as if each line required effort, as if writing it down was something the writer didn't want to do, but felt they had to. There were references to observations, to changes, to results, language that didn't belong to daily life, language that suggested something deliberate, something measured, something that followed a process. And that's when the pattern became clear. This wasn't random. This wasn't chaotic. This was structured, planned, executed with precision, because the entries began to follow a sequence, a repetition of events, a cycle. Something would happen. It would be noted. Then it would happen again. Slightly different, adjusted, refined, as if someone somewhere was testing something. But the most disturbing part was the tone, because there was no justification, no explanation of why, no attempt to make sense of it in a moral or emotional way. Just observation, recording, as if the writer had been placed in a position where they were expected to see, but not to question, to witness, but not to interfere. And that distance, that separation, is what made it feel so unnatural, because it wasn't just what was happening, it was how it was being perceived. Cold, detached, systematic, until it wasn't, because at some point, that distance began to collapse. The writer could no longer maintain it, because what they were witnessing was becoming too clear, too real, too impossible to ignore. The entries started to change again, less structured, more emotional, but not openly, not in a way that expressed feeling directly. Instead, in the way sentences broke, in the way certain words were repeated, in the way the writing became inconsistent, as if the writer's mind was trying to process something that it wasn't prepared to understand. There were moments where the entries stopped mid-sentence, where a thought began but wasn't finished, not crossed out, not corrected, just abandoned, as if continuing would have required saying something that couldn't be said. And then, there were the descriptions, still incomplete, still fragmented, but clearer than before. References to physical changes, to reactions, to outcomes that didn't align with anything normal, anything natural, anything that should have been happening in a place like this. And the way those outcomes were recorded was what made it even more disturbing, because they weren't described with shock, or horror, or even confusion. They were described as results, as if they were expected, as if they were part of the process. And that's when the final realization began to form. This wasn't something that had gone wrong. This was something that had been intended, planned from the beginning, designed to happen, designed to produce these exact outcomes. And the people involved were never meant to leave. Not physically, not historically, not in any way that would allow their existence to be acknowledged. Because acknowledging it would reveal everything, would expose what had been done, what had been allowed, what had been hidden. And that was something that couldn't be risked. The later entries became harder to read, not because of the handwriting, but because of the weight of what was being implied. Because by now, there was no way to pretend that this was anything other than what it was. And the writer knew it. You could feel it in the hesitation of each line, in the way certain words were written more heavily, as if pressing them into the page made them more real, or maybe more permanent, because at this point, the diary had become more than a record. It had become evidence, not of a single event, but of an entire system, a hidden structure operating beneath the visible one. A structure that didn't just exist in secrecy, but depended on it, because without secrecy, it couldn't function, and the moment it was exposed, it would collapse. But it hadn't collapsed. It had continued, long enough to be written about, long enough to be hidden, long enough to be forgotten. And that's what made the final entries the most disturbing of all, because they weren't about what was happening anymore. They were about what was going to happen, what would be done, to make sure this never became known. References to removal, to silence, to ensuring that nothing remained. Not the people, not the place, not the truth. And then, the writing stopped, not gradually, not fading out over time, but suddenly, as if something had interrupted it, as if the act of writing itself had been noticed, and whatever came after that was never recorded. But the most terrifying part wasn't what was written in the diary. It was the fact that the final pages didn't explain how it ended, which means whatever happened next was never meant to be known. The final pages of the diary didn't end with answers. They ended with absence. No conclusion, no explanation, no final statement tying everything together. Just silence. And sometimes, silence tells you more than words ever could. Because if the writer had been allowed to finish, they would have, if they had chosen to stop, there would have been a reason written down. But there was nothing, which meant one thing. The ending wasn't written. It was interrupted. And whatever caused that interruption was powerful enough to erase the final truth completely. But not perfectly. Because even in its incomplete state, the diary had already revealed too much. Enough to understand what had been happening. Enough to see the structure behind it. Enough to realize that this wasn't just an isolated event tied to one plantation, one place, one moment in time. This was something larger, something intentional, something that didn't begin there, and didn't end there either. Because systems like that don't disappear. They evolve. They adapt. They learn from their own exposure. And then, they hide better. The plantation itself no longer exists the way it once did. Time has changed it. Weather has worn it down. The physical structure is nothing more than a fading memory, wood turning to dust, walls collapsing slowly into the earth. But places don't just disappear. They leave behind something. Not always physical. Sometimes it's something else. Something embedded in the land, in the history, in the patterns that continue long after the original structure is gone. Because what was happening beneath that plantation was never truly confined to it. It was part of something larger. A way of thinking. A way of operating. A system that relied on invisibility. On control. On the ability to exist without being acknowledged. And that kind of system doesn't need a single location. It can exist anywhere. As long as the conditions are right. As long as there are people willing to ignore what they don't understand. As long as there are records that can be altered or removed. As long as there are stories that can be reshaped until they no longer reflect the truth. Because that's how it survives. Not by hiding completely, but by blending in. By becoming part of what people already believe. By making the truth feel distant, uncertain, incomplete. And that's exactly what happened here. The plantation became a story. A simple one. A controlled one. Stripped of anything that didn't fit. Anything that raised questions. Anything that pointed to something deeper. Because the deeper truth was never meant to be part of the narrative. It was meant to stay buried. Not in the ground, but in memory. In perception. In the way people understood what had happened. And for a long time, it worked. Because no one questioned it. No one looked beyond what was presented. No one thought to ask what might have been left out. Until the diary was found. And even then, it almost remained hidden. Almost. Because it wasn't just the discovery that mattered. It was what happened after. The person who read it didn't share it. Not immediately. Not openly. At first, it was dismissed. Quietly set aside. Treated as something unimportant. Something that didn't need attention. But that kind of reaction doesn't come from indifference. It comes from recognition. Because once you understand what something truly is, you can't pretend it's nothing. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Because the truth inside those pages was too heavy, too complex, too dangerous to be brought into the open without consequences. Not just for the past, but for the present. Because if what was written in that diary was true, then it meant that history wasn't just incomplete. It was intentionally shaped, curated, controlled in ways that went far beyond simple omission. And if that was possible then, it's possible now. Which leads to the most unsettling realization of all. What if the diary wasn't just documenting something that ended, but something that continued? What if the hidden layer of that plantation wasn't unique? What if it was just one example of a pattern that exists in different forms, in different places, across different times? Because when you look closely, you start to see similarities, gaps in records, unexplained disappearances, stories that don't fully align with the evidence, moments in history where something feels missing, but no one can quite explain what. And those moments are easy to ignore, easy to dismiss, easy to move past, because they don't demand attention. They don't force themselves into the narrative. They exist quietly, just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to connect the pieces, waiting for someone to ask the question, what if this isn't the full story? Because once that question is asked, everything changes. Because now, you're not just looking at history. You're looking through it, at what lies beneath, at what was hidden, at what was never meant to be seen. And once you see that, you can't go back. Because now, every story carries doubt. Every record feels incomplete. Every explanation feels like it might be missing something. And that feeling, that uncertainty, isn't a flaw. It's a signal, a sign that there's more than what's been shown, more than what's been accepted, more than what's been allowed to exist openly. And the diary is proof of that, not because it tells the full truth, but because it shows that the truth was never fully told. And that's what makes it so powerful. Because it doesn't give you answers. It gives you awareness. The awareness that something was hidden, that something was erased, that something was deliberately kept out of sight. And once you have that awareness, you start to see things differently. Not just in the past, but in the present. Because the systems that exist today didn't appear out of nowhere. They were built, layer by layer, decision by decision, influenced by things that came before. Things that may not have been recorded completely. Things that may not have been understood fully. But things that shaped the world anyway. And that's where the final impact lies. Because this isn't just about a diary, or a plantation, or something that happened 150 years ago. It's about the idea that truth can be controlled, that reality can be shaped, that entire parts of existence can be removed from the narrative without leaving obvious traces. And if that's possible, then the question isn't just what was hidden then. It's what might be hidden now, right in front of us, in ways we don't recognize, in places we don't question, in systems we trust without realizing how they were formed. Because the most effective secrets aren't the ones that are buried deep. They're the ones that are hidden in plain sight, disguised as normal, accepted without hesitation, and never fully examined. And that's what makes this story so unsettling. Because it doesn't end with the diary. It begins with it. Because now that it's been read, now that its fragments have been seen, now that its existence can no longer be denied, the silence that followed it becomes even louder. Because silence is never empty. It's filled with what was never said, what was never written, what was never allowed to be known. And in this case, that silence carries something else. A possibility, a question, a truth that wasn't finished, but also wasn't erased, just left incomplete. If this truth was hidden for 150 years, not to protect the past, but to protect what still exists today, then the real question is, what part of it never disappeared and is still waiting to be discovered again? For 150 years, this story was never told. Not because it didn't exist, but because it wasn't allowed to exist. The plantation, the people, the hidden layer beneath it, all of it was carefully removed from the version of history we were given. Not erased completely, but reshaped, softened, controlled in a way that made it easier to accept and impossible to question. Because the truth was never meant to be simple. It was never meant to be seen. And most importantly, it was never meant to be believed. The diary was not just a record. It was a mistake. A crack in something that had been sealed for generations. A single piece of evidence that slipped through a system designed to leave nothing behind. Because everything about what happened there was meant to disappear. The people who were never recorded, the actions that were never explained, the structure that operated beneath everything else, unseen, untouched, unquestioned. All of it was built to exist without leaving a trace. And for a long time, it worked. Because history is not just written by those who win. It's controlled by those who decide what is remembered and what is forgotten. And in this case, for 150 years, this truth was forgotten on purpose. Not buried in the ground, but buried in silence. Because silence is more powerful than destruction. It doesn't remove something. It hides it. It allows it to exist without being noticed. And that's exactly what happened here. The plantation became a story. A simplified version of something far more complex. A version that people could accept without asking questions. A version that didn't require them to look deeper. Because looking deeper would have revealed something they were never meant to see. Something that changes the way you understand everything that came after. Because once you realize that an entire layer of reality can be hidden like this, you begin to question how many others exist. How many stories are incomplete? How many records are missing pieces? How many truths are still sitting just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to notice? Because the most dangerous secrets are not the ones that are locked away. They're the ones that are hidden in plain sight, blended into normality, accepted without resistance, ignored because they don't immediately stand out. And once you understand that, the past stops feeling distant. It stops feeling finished. It becomes something else entirely. Something active. Something connected. Something that didn't end when the plantation fell apart, but continued in different forms, in different places, under different names. Because systems like that don't collapse. They evolve. They learn how to hide better, how to operate more quietly, how to exist without being seen. And the diary is proof of that evolution, because it shows us something that was never meant to be shown. Not clearly, not completely, but enough. Enough to understand that what happened there was not an accident. It was not a mistake, that IT was not something that simply got out of control. It was designed, structured, maintained with purpose, and then hidden with even greater precision. Because the truth of it was too heavy, too disturbing, too dangerous to exist openly. Not just for the people who lived then, but for the people who live now. Because if something like that was possible once, then it's possible again. And maybe it already is. Maybe the reason the diary was hidden so carefully was not just to protect what had already happened, but to make sure no one started looking for similar patterns elsewhere. Because once you recognize the signs, you can't ignore them. You start to see gaps where others see completeness. You start to notice inconsistencies where others see order. You start to question things that once felt certain. And that is what makes this story so powerful. Because it doesn't just reveal a hidden past. It changes the way you see the present. It forces you to ask questions you didn't ask before. To look at things you didn't look at before. To think about what might be missing, even when everything appears complete. Because sometimes, the truth isn't what you see. It's what you don't. And the diary left just enough behind to make sure we never look at history the same way again. Because if a truth this dark could stay hidden for 150 years, not erased, just ignored, then maybe the real horror isn't what was written in that diary. It's what was never written at all.